Hello, Florence, my lovely, the birthday girl. Are you ready for chapter 7? It's called The Very Good Idea. With increasing frequency, Ada took to sitting alongside Mary while Peeves tutored. She didn't really participate, although she did offer the occasional correction when Peeves got something wrong. When Ada did engage Peeves, it was usually to ask if he had a book on a particular subject. If he did not, he'd bring one the next morning, and she'd spend the day engrossed. Few things distracted Ada from her bubble of reading, but she did note a curious exchange between Mary and Peeves, and a second curious exchange between Peeves and Mary. Ada had never been terribly good at picking up on curious exchanges, and was pleased to think she was getting better at it. In the first exchange, Ada could tell that Mary was unusually emotional about thanking Peeves for being her tutor. It turned out, as Ada listened intently, that Mary's only alternative would have been to be sent away to school. This thought visibly frightened Mary, being away from her family, enduring a school's strict order and endless recitation, and being struck with a cane for breaking rules you might not even know about. This was all awful, of course, but what interested Ada most were little nuances she never noticed before. A certain something in Mary's voice, the way the pupils of her eyes got bigger, how her mouth tightened ever so slightly. All these things were being cataloged and labeled and filed away in Ada's brain for later reference. So this is what happens when people are upset and trying not to show how much, she thought. Fascinating. The second exchange, and this was quite brilliant as far as Ada was concerned, occurred when Peeves showed up late and out of sorts and confessed to Mary that he had been particularly distressed by a story in the newspaper about impoverished orphans. Ada noted that as he talked, bright red spots appeared on his cheeks, which was interesting, but the brilliant part was the newspaper itself. Ada had never given much thought to newspapers before, but as soon as she looked at one, it was like opening 100 books at once. Odd, disconnected bits of information. Names, deaths and marriages, fires and kidnappings, courts and magistrates, announcements of inventions and medicines, information that might take years to find its way into books. Some of this was clearly rubbish. One bit would contradict the bit next to it, and they couldn't both be true, which led Ada to wonder who was putting this newspaper together in the first place. What frustrated Ada was that as soon as she became interested in a bit of information in the newspaper, the article was over. When she expressed this, Peeves told her that there would be another newspaper the next day with more information, and Ada could scarcely believe she had been missing out on this small miracle all this time. Days passed in a new routine of Ada's descending the stairs upon Mary's arrival, and of Peeves' gifting of the morning paper. Ada would spend much of the morning reading, interrupting Peeves to ask him the odd question to determine if the scandals of members of Parliament might be interesting. They weren't. And then more or less settling into a comfortable fog of carpets and tea and tinkering and drawing and biscuits. Crime, said Ada one afternoon out of nowhere while reading the newspaper. There was a goodly bit about crime in the newspaper. Mary had been reading too, a book on Greek mythology. Orpheus was climbing the long stair out of the underworld and was about to take a forbidden glance at Eurydice, I'm not sure, to see if she was still there. Eurydice, I'm not sure how to say that name. Mary always wanted to shout at him not to do it. Crime, Ada repeated. I've never really thought about it before. I imagine there's much wickedness in the world, answered Mary in a detached way. Why? Asked Ada. I can't say. Perhaps it is just in our nature, said Mary, looking up from her book. But you have a nature, and you're not a criminal. And after a pause, Ada asked, Are you? Heavens, no. One makes choices. Choices have consequences, Mary repeated, though she couldn't say from where. So criminals are choosing to be criminals? Ada had a way of asking questions that didn't sound like a question, and Ada had a way of knowing when. Sorry, Mary had a way of knowing when. I suppose so. I think it depends on the crime. If you're starving and steal bread, I imagine you don't have much choice. But if you're a kidnapper or a highwayman, then yes, those are choices. I never really thought about it. Criminals aren't very clever, Ada declared. No? No, they get caught. It's always in the newspaper. Once they don't say caught, only they don't say caught, they say apprehended, which means the same thing. Well, I imagine criminal not getting apprehended would make wouldn't make much of a newspaper story, so they leave that bit out. Leave bits out of the newspaper? Well, I'm only supposing, but I can hardly see them putting things in the newspaper that don't happen. No, agreed Ada, that makes sense. She pondered. So the newspaper criminals are the not clever ones, and the ones that aren't in the newspaper must be clever. Not as clever as you, I'm sure, said Mary. Probably not, admitted Ada. She wasn't boasting. It was just very likely to be true. I imagine, said Mary, her mind returning to her book, that you could apprehend quite a few criminals, being more clever than they. That would at least put them in the newspaper, agreed Ada, the idea striking her as rather tidy somehow. Once things were in the newspaper, they were almost as good as being in books, and that meant she had a place in her brain to put them, like solving a puzzle. I could be a magistrate or on the constabulary and put criminals in the newspaper. Prison, corrected Mary. Criminals go to prison, not to the newspaper. This point seemed completely irrelevant to Ada. But you couldn't, of course. Young ladies cannot be magistrates or on the constabulary. Why not? Asked Ada. Because we are young ladies, and you especially are a young lady. Big L. Young lady. Big L. It's simply not allowed. Ada was displeased at this. Your mum wrote that book, she said. Mary was puzzled, thinking Ada was referring to the half-closed Greek mythology book Mary kept open with her thumb. Your mom wrote that girls can do whatever, Ada continued. Education, profession. Mary was now fully engaged and put down her book. My dear Ada, my mother wrote about how things ought to be, not how they are. Ada continued, looking displeased, which made Mary go on. Of course, how are things to be the way they ought unless we make them so? And if clever criminals can make choices to become criminal and remain clever enough to not go to prison or the newspaper, she added for Ada's benefit, then why can't we be magistrates or on the constabulary? In fact, we ought to be, if we so choose. Well, we can't, said Ada. I'm only 11 and you're 14. There is that, admitted Mary. And if Mother or Peeves found out, they would be, yes, incendiary. Theoretically, that would only be if they found out, said Mary cautiously. A secret constabulary, constabulary. I think I've been saying it wrong. See, readers, we're always working on with this, figuring things out. Constabulary. I'm not sure. I'm going to have to look it up later. I don't have a chance to do that right now. Fascinating. The secret constabulary, then, said Ada. Thus satisfied, she returned to her newspaper. To Mary's way of thinking, rather a lot depended on those words, and to her the word secret meant intrigue, adventure, romance. It meant everything that Mary, in her 14-year-old heart of hearts, knew that she was. The word secret had suddenly made Mary's heart bang around madly in her ribs, as the butterfly had done weeks before. She thought she was going to burst. This, said Mary, as calmly as she could, was hardly at all, is a very good idea. What is? Said Ada, who wasn't reading her newspaper, having forgotten already. A secret constabulary, replied Mary, except they are called private detectives. A detective agency, and she leaned forward for full effect, whispering, a secret one. Ada still wasn't fully aware of what Mary was saying and continued with the part of her brain that didn't think it needed to be. You could put an advertisement in the newspaper, she suggested without enthusiasm. How can we advertise something that's a secret? Said Mary. Well, said Ada, a bit more of her brain paying attention, you could say there's a detective agency and keep secret the bit that where it is us. You know, that's terribly clever. Mm-hmm, said Ada. Look at out there. There's Ada. Well, this way. Ada's in her chair, and Mary's down in the corner trying to figure out how she can start a detective agency. And we would need to come up with a secret name, or rather, a name for the secret to put it in the advertisement in the newspaper. You should call it after your mom. It was her idea, said Ada, which it wasn't, not technically, but Mary knew what she meant. What was her name? Mary, said Mary. That's not a very good secret name. It's yours. Does she have another name? Wollstonecraft, said Mary, smiling, and that was that. That's the end of that chapter. Man, I had trouble with that word. But I love how now I can call it just a detective agency. Detectives. The constabulary. Yeah. That's a old-fashioned word that means detective. I love that they're going to start a detective agency. Chapter 8, The Advertisement. That, as it turned out, was not entirely that. While the girls, who had increasingly begun to think of themselves as the Wollstonecraft girls, made plans and imagined the adventures they were sure to come, there was still the matter of the advertisement and Peebs. Mr. Franklin, Ada assured Mary, could be trusted to occupy or divert Peebs as needed. Mary wasn't exactly sure how this was supposed to happen, but Ada was quite confident in the matter. Mr. Franklin had been in Ada's life since she was a baby, and she trusted him like no one else. As for the advertisement itself, depending on what it was to say, was the easy part. Mary wrote, and Ada agreed to, Wollstonecraft Detective Agency, a private and secret constabulary for the apprehension of clever criminals. Beneath this was a request to forward inquiries to the Times office itself, where Mary assured Ada there were slots for accepting whatever letters they might receive in response. The girls would somehow have to ensure that these letters were collected daily. Getting the advertisement to the newspaper, however, would have to be, as Mary pointed out, clandestine. She opened her mouth to explain that clandestine, that's it, was another word for secret, but then imagined Ada rolling her eyes and insisting she already knew. So Mary closed her mouth again. Why clandestine? Asked Ada. Dear Ada, a girl can hardly appear at the Times on her own on such extraordinary business. You could be running an errand for someone else. That would be unlikely, as no one would send a girl on such an errand. On any errand, really, except perhaps an errand between other young ladies, which would omit the Times. You come here on your own, Ada pointed out, or at least you intend to. Riding in a carriage without an escort is modern, but traveling out and about unescorted is unheard of. Ada, why? Ada, a young lady needs to protect her reputation. I can't imagine what it would do to my family for someone to even think that something improper was going on where I was concerned. What's improper about placing an advertisement in the newspaper? Nothing, except, of course, when one wishes to keep such matters in confidence. But it's the appearance of the thing. They'd throw me out in the street were I to show up on my own. They wouldn't dare, said Ada, shocked. They would, Ada, they would. That's not fair. No, it isn't, but it's the way it is, so we need a plan. It took a full day for Mary to figure it out, but she finally realized that she already knew someone who was very good at being clandestine. The next morning, when the carriage came from by the Godwin house, Mary was prepared. Charles, she said to the boy behind Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. I'm not supposed to be here, said Charles. We've been through this. Yes, you're not here, understood. And that makes you perfectly suited for the task that compels me to bestow upon you. Are you, said Charles after a moment, a damsel in distress? Mary thought about it. No, not really. There are damsels in distress in Ivanhoe, Charles stated. Mary persevered. But I am a friend in need, and rather specifically in need of your not being here. Officially, that is to say. You need me to leave? No, no, no. Well, yes, actually. What I mean to say is, you said you worked? Mm, came the reply, Charles being clearly uninterested in the subject. What do you do, if you don't mind terribly me asking? I work at the boot polish factory. I glue the labels on. That must be very, said Mary. It is, said Charles. But you can get to places unchaperoned, places like the Times? You want me to travel in time? Times, the, the newspaper. I require someone, and for the second time that week she leaned forward to whisper loudly for evidence. I require someone clandestine. That, fair maiden, I shall be your gallant. Then, fair maiden, I shall be your gallant, said Charles, suddenly fully present. She assumed his answer must be something from his book. Brilliant, said Mary, her enthusiasm overtaking her. I'd be ever so grateful if you would place this advertisement in the newspaper, and of course retrieve the replies, should there be any, in the coming days. Here's a tuppence for the ad, and here, she added him the slip of paper, is what we needed to say. Only please keep it clandestine. Charles had put his book away altogether. You have my word, my lady. And with this, he half stood, placed his hand across his heart with a half bow, opened the door, and leapt out of the carriage. Alone, unchaperoned, and uncharlesed, Mary wondered for the first time about the consequences of her choices. Ooh, that was a good chapter. I love that the detective agency has begun, or trying to begin. All right, my lovely. Until next time.